Hey, good morning, everybody, but especially good morning to Luttrell. It's Thursday. It's Law and Legitimacy. Mike's in North Carolina. I'm in Vermont. We got the Union covered, but the East Coast is covered these days in wildfire fog and haze. I drove up from Connecticut last night. It was bad in Connecticut. It was bad in Massachusetts, but about 60 miles into Vermont, the sky's cleared and I breathe free and clear up here. But at my little hideaway, there's no water up here today. So, paradise always comes with its challenges. I'll have to figure out what's going on later on. Right now, there's a whole crazy world to talk about. Tucker'd Carlson's back on Twitter. I don't know if you saw it. It's called episode number 1. It's about a 10 or 11 minute episode. And he raises questions about what happened with the bombing of the dam in the Ukraine the other day. The mainstream media was quick to point out that this was yet another example of the mendacity and evilness of of Vladimir Putin. I almost said Boris Yeltsin. There you go. Boris Godunov. And then he said, wait a minute, this is a dam that ultimately benefits Russia and benefits, hydration in Crimea and so on and so forth. So he raised questions and, this inflames a lot. I mean, the mainstream media has a series of headlines today about Tucker and conspiracy theory and feeding hate, doing this and doing that. Hey, here's the deal. Maybe he's just raising questions, and maybe he's just raising questions of the sort that those who run with the pack in mainstream media don't want to address because they're too busy following the mainstream narrative. People used to think, I had a very interesting experience with a sometime listener of this show. I won't mention her last name, first name Janice. We were talking about the Church Committee and James Rison's book, A Last Honest Man, and talking about the extent to which the CIA and FBI were involved in domestic hijinks in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And she was stunned by it and sent a link to me about something about poisonings by the CIA. And I sent her a reference to Sidney Gottlieb. There's a wonderful book on him called The Last Poison, or I think no, it's not The Last Poisoner, but America's Poisoner or something like that. I happen to be reading that right now as well. Gottlieb was a career scientist, a biochemist who for 20 years masterminded CIA efforts to use mind control drugs to alter the thinking of people and as a means of interrogating people. And often people would be drugged against their will. There was just our government once fed psychedelics unwittingly to prisoners in an institution for 70 consecutive days in an attempt to see what it would do to them. Well, it wasn't good. There are documented cases of people who killed themselves after these confrontations, surreptitious confrontations with our government's intelligence agency. What would the mainstream media say about that today? Oh, it can't be true. That sounds like conspiracy theorizing. Well, it was true. And I don't know whether what Tucker is saying is true or not. Neither does the mainstream media. He's running hypotheses by people, given the data that's available to them, and giving them the choice to think through things and to give themselves some critical distance from what they're being fed by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and others. Again, I don't know who's right. I don't know who's true. I'm not prepared to accept anything at face value at any point. Given the law of numbers, okay, the editorial boards and staff, Washington Post, New York Times, and others, against lonely Tucker in his basement, I like the odds of a group arriving at the truth better than I do one individual. But I also know the dangers of groupthink. And I know that in dystopian times, the last honest man is often the first person you want to listen to. So what are Tucker's options as a matter of law? He's reported to be under contractual obligation with Fox not to broadcast until at least 2025. Conspiracy theorists say, oh, how convenient, marginalizing him during the 2024 electoral race. Again, I don't know about that as well, but let's talk about his contractual options and let's talk about his contractual obligations and his options. And I want to blow a hypothesis you won't read in the New York Times by you. Let's say that Tucker has a contract with Fox not to compete, not to otherwise take to the air and draw viewership.
Let's set this up, if you don't mind, Norm. Let's set this up a little bit more. I've got here on the screen, so I just want to make sure that we can get the statistics. But look at that, 101.8 million views at this point. This is episode 1 of Tucker on Twitter. So this is about a 10.5-minute video that he posted on Tuesday. And this has, there was no lead up, right? This isn't something that he promoted or advertised or told people to tune into. He just published it on his own. And here we are. It is Thursday morning. So likely less than 48 hours after he has published his first episode of Tucker on Twitter. And he has 101.8 million views on that video.
Yeah, that's pretty astounding. So let's think. So he's got a contract with Fox. It says I'm going to be quiet, and you're going to continue to pay me for $25 million. Let's just use that number, whether that's the whole amount or it's some greater than that. If he breaches that contract, if he breaks it, Fox can pursue a remedy against him. Now let's talk about what a contract is. In simple terms, a contract is an agreement. It's an agreement that the law will enforce. It's a set of promises that the law will enforce. Usually, at least in the theory of the law, parties meet, they bargain for exchanges of promises. One side promises to pay X, the other side promises to do or forego doing Y. There's something that changes hands of value, consideration, and those promises become enforceable as a matter of law. A party who breaks the contract is liable to a claim of breach on the other side, and the other side can get from that aggrieving party damages, usually damages in the form of money damages, money that should be paid because you didn't perform your end of the contract. I'm not going to perform mine. I paid you already. Therefore, I want my money back. But there's another form of relief in the law known as equitable relief. Years ago, a century ago, American courts and courts throughout the Western world were divided between courts of law and equity. Legal remedies were one that were specified by usually statute or settled legal doctrine. Equity was what you did when the law failed. Those were the king's courts in Britain, and judges were free to craft remedies in the name of fairness, craft relief in the name of fairness. An equitable relief might be an injunction, an order enjoining or prohibiting a person from doing some deed X. In Tucker's case, appearing on Fox. It might also be in the form of performing some act, performing an act that you are obliged to perform. In Tucker's case, it wouldn't be returning to Fox. They fired him. So and there's some talk online about Fox now suing Tucker and Tucker's lawyers, whoever they are, fainting in the direction of a First Amendment defense for Tucker. He doesn't have a legal First Amendment defense on the breach of contract theory. He agreed to cease and desist. He agreed to not do certain things in exchange for money damage or money payments. If Fox wants to hold him to the contract, he can agree to he can continue not to do the prohibited acts and continue to receive their money. If he breaks the contract, Fox can get its money back, or they can stop paying him. Those are typical contract remedies, and contracts are usually reducible to a financial basis. In other words, contracts have a fungible value. They can be traded on the marketplace. You can calculate their damages in terms of dollars. And now the law of contracts has a twist. It's not based in morality. You're not required to perform on every promise you make. Some promises are flat out illegal. Pay me $10 and I'll kill your ex-wife. You call me up, she's still alive. Where's my $10? Which one of us is going to go to court and get a judge to enforce that contract? That contract is against public policy. With respect to Tucker's contract with Fox, it's a typical dissolution clause in a relationship between parties in a commercial context. And so Fox has a claim for money damages, and it can make that claim against Tucker. But here's where things get interesting. Every contract, because it can be reduced to fungible terms, has a value. Every contract has a value in the marketplace. So let's say the payment to Tucker...
Unless it specifies in the contract, at least on its face, there is this concept known as irreparable damages.
Well, let's get to that in a minute. Let's take it one step at a time. So every contract has a value. And so Tucker can say, wait a minute, it's going to cost me $25 million to breach. Okay, I got 100 clicks on Twitter in 48 hours. If each of them gave me $1, I got 100 million. he'll write a check to Fox for 25 million and make 75. And so this is the Tucker Carlson challenge, in my view, at least in terms of the fungible value of the contract. Can he raise more than he owes Fox? And is it worth it to him to do so? Because quite frankly, if he could raise $50 million from supporters, he could make the same 25, do what he enjoys, write a check for Fox and say, adios, I'm out of here. Now, Mike raises an interesting point. If the contract can somehow try to encompass some sort of equitable form of relief, they may seek to enjoin him. And in that instance, there may be a First Amendment defense in there because the value of speech is unique in American law. I've not seen the contract, and I think it would be an enormous blow to Fox to say, but Tucker wants to pay us the value of the contract, but no, we don't want his money. We want his silence, because if Tucker talks, we're irreparably harmed. I mean, why not just give up, dissolve, and sell your studios to CNN at that point?
Well, I think that I want to bring this up because I love the remedies conversation. This is, from a legal education perspective, this is the broad umbrella that we qualify as remedies. And, there's an entire first year course called contracts as a doctrinal element of your curriculum. And you can elect later on to take something along the lines of remedies. And I certainly did. It's something that I really quite enjoyed, because there is this overarching sense that the justice system in the civil context is able to make an aggrieved party whole. And that is the objective of damages and remedies, ultimately. So compensatory awards, if you think about plaintiffs' attorneys for slip and fall and stuff like that, there are jury awards that exceed, because they'll take into account, how young the aggrieved party is, what their medical bills will be like, pain and suffering, these things.
They're foreseeable harm,
right? And it's this ever changing course to try and pinpoint how to make a damaged party whole. In other words, to put them back in the position they would have been but for the accident, right? Or but for the breach of contract. And in certain contracts that include provisions such as a non-competition or a covenant not to compete, it is very often the case, or those that contain confidentiality provisions, right? Non-disclosure and confidentiality provisions. It is most often the case that in the remedies section of that contract, not only will you specify, whether you must arbitrate, where you must arbitrate, whatever the governing law is, but there will be an acknowledgement on the party that wants to bind the other to confidentiality, to non-solicitation, to non-competition, that a breach of any of those provisions is not adequately redressed by monetary damages, and therefore is irreparable, and equitable or injunctive relief is the remedy that they will provide for. Now, in that context, that means this, Norm. If this language that I have highlighted on the screen, because we don't know what his contract says, right? We've got a letter quoted by Axios that refers to the contract. It's not a reading of the contract. But if this quoted language is somehow within the contract at issue here, it says prohibited from rendering services of any type whatsoever, whether over the internet via streaming or similar distribution or other digital distribution, whether now known or hereafter devised. So if we get into this non-competition, this covenant not to compete conversation, then I get to nerd out a little more and talk about, what a reasonable restriction on one's ability to do their thing. Covenants not to compete are regulated by time, territory, and scope. On the face of this, I would say that this is not an enforceable covenant not to compete.
No, I would think that's right. I mean, among other reasons, it may be against public policy. Basically, what it's saying is your speech will irreparably harm us, such that we're buying your silence for the foreseeable, for whatever the term of the contract is, and that strikes me as unconscionable. I mean, in a marketplace of ideas analysis, has there ever been an enforceable term like this in a contract binding a media personality? I can't think of one.
Not to my knowledge. And what court sitting in sort of an equitable capacity is going to look at at parties to a contract. Now, a court might decide that someone like Fox News and someone like Tucker Carlson are sophisticated enough to have agreed, right? But there needs to be some recognition of, okay, time. How long is Tucker barred from indulging in services of any type whatsoever, right? Via the internet, streaming or whatever, where is he prescribed from doing that? The world over, because the internet connects everything, right? And then, and what's the scope, right? What is the scope of the prohibition? Is Tucker not allowed to do anything that involves him speaking into a camera? That again, on its face, seems unreasonable.
So, for example, when it says prohibited from rendering services of any type whatsoever, that might be services. If I were to pay him $1 per broadcast, he might be rendering me a service. If he gets online and then speaks without compensation and says, I'm open to your contributions, I'm not sure that's rendering service as a matter of law. And one of the things, Mike, you learned in remedies, I never took the course. I learned it the hard way with a series of ass kickings administered and received over the course of decades. But there's not a wrong. There's not every remedy doesn't. Every wrong doesn't have a remedy. There are some times where the law is silent, and it's understood that in the hurly-burly of the marketplace and the rough and tumble of life, people just move on and take their lumps. Fox looks like a deer in the headlights in this case, and the notion that Fox might try to seek equitable relief against Carlson would, in my view, kill the network's credibility for all time. I would then I would put Fox in the category of MSNBC were it to do this. And if it would be a sign of utter desperation and a confession that it has no mission other than the presentation of personalities that it seeks to capture for the most venal of motives. Justin asks, is there any precedent on this? I'm not aware of one. I'm not a media lawyer, Justin. I'm curious. I'll be looking. And I would dare Fox to bring this action. Yeah. And I would dare Tucker to say to his people, create a GoFundMe page, the Tucker Carlson Relief Fund. I need $25 million to buy my way out of the fatal embrace of Fox News. Will you help me? I'd contribute $10. Well, I might even contribute a little more. What would you guys consider contributing? And wouldn't it be a decisive move to put $25 million in Tucker's pocket and tell him, keep talking, and slap Rupert Murdoch and the cowards in C-suite at Fox News right in the face, right where they should be smacked.
Well, this is going to move quickly, in my opinion. So, Justin, to your question as to whether there's any precedent, I'm going to give you the typical lawyer response, and I apologize in advance, but it is true. It depends.
No, the typical lawyer response. I'll answer you, but first, write me a check for $250. Yeah. And then once the check is written, the typical lawyer response is,
well, it depends, and that depends on where this contract is to be enforced, right? Choice of law is huge. Venue is huge. So in terms of what precedent we would be looking at, we don't necessarily know. We also don't know what causes of action are going to be brought beyond a breach of contract, and we also don't know what theory of damages they're going to assert. My expectation from this is that it's going to move quickly because Fox is going to want to get some sort of temporary restraining order and preliminary injunction to preclude Tucker from continuing to do this during the pendency of the underlying breach of contract action. And so the real money is to be made in defending against that, or Tucker could go on offense and seek a temporary restraining order or a preliminary injunction, right, to stop Fox from exercising or trying to enjoin his conduct. I wouldn't advise that. I don't think that there's really any basis for that. But ultimately, I think that this is going to get really hot really fast.
Well, I think this is a test of Tucker's support in the marketplace. If Tucker can generate $25-30 million by crowdsourcing or by from his sources, then he should counterclaim and he should double down as to Fox, and he should say, look, you want $25 million? Did I breach the contract? Here it is. Now go find yourself another tool to ride. Hey, let's say good morning to Bathtub Liquor, Aperture of My Soul, Matthew Kyle. Lawyer Will asks whether we still think that the termination of Tucker was related to the Dominion lawsuit. I don't know. I mean, suppose it was. Suppose there was. Suppose you were able to find admissible evidence that that Tucker's departure was a term, even a silent term of the agreement. Tucker could arguably then claim that there was a breach of the duty of good faith and fair dealing by by Fox in terms of how it managed his contract. Every contract has both expressed and implied terms. And so when you hear lawyers talk about a contract, they're talking about something which is in the four corners of the agreement, if that's in writing, or that was clearly understood by the parties and expressly bargained for by their words, if it's an oral contract. But the law imports certain conditions into contracts for things that you might not have spoken about, but are believed to be understood. And one of the law's great fictions is that parties in the marketplace operate in good faith and that they deal fairly with one another. Thus, I go to the used car lot. I go to the used car lot and I say, "Give me that red car over there," and they deliver it to me without the tires. And the guy tries to say, "You didn't say you were buying the tires. You only said you were buying the red car." Well, the tires were understood as part of the package.
Yeah,
and
an
so
implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing is what it's called. Right.
Well,
and
they call them warranties in other part of the states, but the other, yeah. So Tucker, let's keep an eye on this fight. I think it's going to be a fun one.
Yeah. Another good fight that I'm enjoying is this one.
Oh yeah, tell me about it.
Well, look, Jokic is likely one of the most dominant big men we've ever seen. It's amazing. So, I hate that T-Girl's not here for me to dunk on her the way that Jokic was dunking all over the Miami Heat last night. But the series is now at 2-1. Jokic has a triple-double that, right here I've got sportingnews.com on the screen, and they're calling it historic. But 30-plus points, 20-plus rebounds, 10-plus assists in one game is simply unbelievable. I'm enjoying how dominant this Denver team is, and I'm also enjoying how quietly they assembled this team that is so dominant, while everybody else in the Western Conference thought that they were doing something remarkable that really weren't. I'm also, I do want to give credit to the Miami Heat simply because, in the post-LeBron era, Eric Spoelstra and his staff and the franchise have pulled together quite a few people who went undrafted. And we're seeing a number of undrafted NBA players in the biggest stage in the NBA right now. So if you are a fan of basketball, this is a series that I would suggest that you watch. I recommend that you watch, just because it is going to be quite a while before we see something as pure as what we're seeing on the floor tonight. None of the big named NBA stars, in the absence of Jimmy Butler and Jokic and Murray, are on the floor. And even those guys are sort of like maybe B-list celebrities. And I don't mean that in any condescending way, but they're not necessarily the guys that you start thinking of and you're like, all right, top 5, top 10, whatever. These guys are grinders. These guys know how to compete, and the product on the floor is as good as you could want out of a final series. So I'm really enjoying it.
Let me ask a stupid question.
Sure.
Why do we have to wait almost a week between each game? I'm used to when I'm watching a series, you play a couple games in one venue, you take a day off, you go to the other, you play 3 games, maybe in 4 days if you're following the mercy rules. If it goes to game 6 or 7, you take a day off, you go play the other games on a weekend. It feels like this is like going on forever. What are they trying to get a 4th of July final?
Yeah, it's money. You got to stretch it out for the ad dollars. You got to get all the television shows going on, all the talking heads, that kind of stuff. But I do love the chat here. T-Girl shows up. It's a blip, Boyer. The fat they, them is not singing. Love that.
A blip. Well, let's see if Miami can rise to the heat. The next game will be Saturday night. I guess we have to wait a few days. These men must get their beauty sleep after all. Lots going on in reparations world all of a sudden. And, while we're talking about money, the 1619th Project has managed to weasel its way into, I guess, grade school math and junior high math and maybe even high school math curricula. What's this about a reparations math and reparations history? Do I get to say, if I identify as the descendant of an African American slave, that I don't need to take math? That mastery of math is imposing cultural appropriation on me, and therefore I'm not obliged to take math and should be given money as reparations? Or is this something more insidious?
Well, get your abacus out, because you got to count the ways that you owe reparations, Norm. So this is a collaborative effort between the 1619 Project and the Pulitzer Center. If you can believe
the Pulitzer Center. Oh my goodness. So
the idea is that some of these, so this is a high school curriculum.
We are changing the pronoun you to yo.
Yep. And I think the idea here is that they are going to try and convert some high school math classes into a discussion of reparations and racial justice, rather than just being, I don't know, learning basics of arithmetic and math. So the 1619 Project, they've obviously since 2020 really surged in the news, and they've already got curriculums in schools all over the country. And so what I've got here on the screen, I'll you can read the lesson summary over to the side. It says students apply math skills, research into historical wealth gaps in the U.S., and an analysis of different reparations models to an investigation into whether or not reparations should be paid to the descendants of enslaved people in the U.S. Immediately, I question what is the motive for putting this forth, right? If it's so,
well, you know what the motive is. The
well, I
motive
mean,
is to normalize the concept. And
what
the
education?
motive is to normalize race-based transfer payments. So it used to be that when you did math, Johnny was traveling at 3 miles per hour in the direct east, and Susie was passing, going the opposite direction at 2 miles per hour. There's 10 miles between them. When will they meet? That used to be an algebra problem. Now it's going to be, they made sugar there, and a black man did it, and now he's worth, his family is worth 20% less or 120% less than the white family next door. Calculate how much money it would take to make Johnny equal to the other family, assuming that his descendants were enslaved 100 years ago. I mean, unpack that in an algebra class, and you're going to be walking across the hall to your social science teacher, if they still have them, and say, huh? Didn't I just read in the Global Slavery Index that there are 49.6 people currently enslaved in the world? 2.3 million in Pakistan, 11 million in India, 5.8 million in China, 2.6 million in North Korea. What are we going to do about giving them reparations? And the discussion starts to get totally crazy, because built into the reparations context discussion is this notion of social equity, is this notion of redressing history's wrong, such that there is an equality of condition obtaining among people. Well, why pick some people rather than another? And at the borders, we talked yesterday about Mayor Adams' proposal that New Yorkers open their homes to migrants in exchange for money. And we raised questions about whether this would ultimately lead to Third Amendment questions about quartering strangers in people's homes. But you begin to see a brave new world wherein, if we owe reparations to one people that have been historically aggrieved, don't we owe them to all? And shouldn't we open our borders, our homes, our community to the world and say, come on in, folks. Take what you need, because our needs are the same as yours. And until everybody's needs are fulfilled, no one will be satisfied. And if that means we put you in my home, well, that's fine. If that means we give you such and such a block in X or Y or Z community, that's fine, because global equity requires it. There's, at the United Nations yesterday, an American representative to the United Nations basically called on the body to call for reparations in the United States, independent of the will of American people, to impose it as a matter of global equity. When you hear people talk about globalism, when you hear people fear world government, when you hear people react and are with anger and suspicion to this and be characterized as populists, these are the moral imperatives that they're responding to. And if you don't say something when you see something about this, don't be surprised if something unusual or intolerable or something you don't want to live with happens. And so I think we raise these discussions here not to suggest that America is the city on a hill that everyone should aspire to be, not to suggest that there aren't historic inequities, there are, but to suggest, to return to a concept we talked about with Tucker, to suggest that there are particular remedies in this place and time that can do anything other than compound the harm or create new forms of social tension is naive in my view. And
Norm, man, it feels like we're glossing over how crazy of a proposition this is that I have on the screen. But just to read that first sentence, Howard Law professor Justin Hansford addressed the United Nations Permanent Forum on People of African Descent last week and called for the establishment of a United Nations Reparations Tribunal that could order the payment of reparations to African Americans. We have a Biden-appointed diplomat at the UN advocating that the UN put together a body, a tribunal, that could order Americans to pay other Americans based on.
Oh, no sovereignty issues there. And he teaches law. Well, it's funny, when I first read that story, I thought Harvard University, and I thought, man, things really are crazy there. Howard is an historically Black university, and I'm sure this professor has a valid law degree, and I'm sure he's got something to say. But Uncle Joe, he's an ambassador to the United Nations. This is the face we want to show to the world. This is a policy priority of your administration, such that it deserves a global showcase. Ho, hey, hey, ho, ho, Uncle Joe, he's got to go.
I'm nearly speechless, and I shouldn't be, because it is facially absurd. But at a certain point, we have to stop just pointing our fingers at things and kind of poking fun at them.
No, we need to deconstruct the logic and talk about the impossibility of it, and talk about the policy consequences, which is why I raised those numbers from, about global slavery. I mean, there are those who, in the economic or the environmental justice movement, there are those who say that the industrial world, and that would include Black Americans living within it, owes the third world environmental reparations, because we have caused most of the harm, or most of the pollution in the industrial world that has led to global warming, and the consequences of that fall hardest on undeveloped countries. And thus, when people flee the untenable economic and environmental conditions of these countries as they respond to global warming, they come here. Well, maybe we should open our borders as a form of reparations. Maybe we should impose a 50% tax on every transaction, so that we can transfer money over to the third world. Maybe we should say to every person who doesn't enjoy the median standard of living in the United States, here's a check. Here are social payments to assure that you rise to this level. The problem with that is it all comes at a cost, and that's a cost paid by members of the populist movement who are saying, wait a minute, I get out of bed in the morning, I put my shoes on, I go to work just like everybody else. And you're telling me I've got to pay 50% more for that gallon of milk to address historic problems that I was no part of, to address global inequities that I may in fact benefit by, but that can't be corrected. History is tragic. It was never meant to be a romantic comedy in which everybody in the end is reconciled and lives happily ever after. That's the whole concept, and that's the power of the notion of original sin and living in a world that can't be made perfect. It's the pot saying to the potter, why makest me thus, and demanding that their world be reformed in their own image, that causes further problems. And this call for reparations at the UN, the importation of reparations into mathematics curriculums in schools, it doesn't end well. Doesn't end well for anyone.
Justin comments in the chat. He says it's slowly making its way up the ladder. I would refine that. It's not slow, and it's also not making its way up the ladder. This is an offensive from multiple fronts, right? So when you see something like a curriculum being unveiled at the high school level that is advocating policy positions and legislation under the guise of a math curriculum, you have to understand that these are future voters that are being indoctrinated and asking to do a project that does not have no as a recommendation or a passing answer as an answer to that original question of should reparations be paid. It's a matter of how, right? So it's an implied yes, and it's a how, and the issue therein lies therein, right? If we have diplomats from the U.S. going on the global stage and creating an exogenous atmosphere in the rest of the West that this is something that the United States wants, and then we have a future demographic of voters being indoctrinated or programmed to believe that there is no way to say no to this, we have to figure out a way to do it. Well, then it becomes at a certain point an inevitability that needs to be, right? So
possibly, Justin says, time to repost all your writings on this topic from years ago. I called it, I don't know what I called, but I do recall at the time of George Floyd, watching the interaction between the police and Floyd and viewing it as tragic. I think Floyd brought 95% of what happened to him on himself by failing to comply with simple requests, but he was out of his mind, whether he had a psychiatric problem or was high or stoned or intoxicated or both. He couldn't breathe when he was sitting alone in the back of the car. Officers are trained to use force. Force was used used. It was applied to the upper regions of the chest and or neck too long. Floyd died. There's an issue there. But to suggest that Floyd was picked out because he was black and that this should have spawned the summer of love in 2020 and the riots and the arson and everything else, in my mind was ridiculous. And I smelled the whiff of reparations in there, because when a routine interaction has come to symbolize what's wrong with American history and what can be made right can only be made right with money damage payments in the future and changes in social institutions that redirect resources, I start to feel like it's part of an economic and demographic shakedown. It's no mystery that in 2040 or thereabouts, the demographics in the United States shall change such that Caucasians are a minority in the country, and with numbers comes power. And so my view is so much of the reparations movement has to do with redistribution of social resources in favor of a group that has an emergent sense of power and an historic sense of grievance. All of us have historic senses of grievance. I'm in this country because my family fled Greece, in part because of the violence there with the Turks. I'm not demanding reparations from Turkey. I'm not demanding reparations from Greece for failing to protect me. When my family came here, it came here because it thought there would be equality of opportunity for all, and that people would enter the marketplace at whatever position they did, and they would fight for what they could get, and they would keep what they earned. Somehow that ethic is being undermined in a society in which we're told that until we all live at the same standard, however low that might be, and now globally, whatever that standard might be, therefore those above the mean owe those below the mean something. That's socialism, and it may be a vision of how to distribute local, regional, and global resources that the people want, and it may be what they get, but it comes at a cost. It comes at a cost to liberty, and it will come at a cost of alienating people who've worked hard for what they have and don't want to give it up because somebody else says you got more than I do, and it just isn't fair.
That's true, and it'll come at a cost much higher than that to the individuals who are on the front end of that disenfranchisement. And there are examples of this going on currently around the world. We don't need to get into the details right now, but suffice it to say that we as a people on this planet have very short goldfish-like memories when it comes to the harm we are capable of creating for ourselves and the despair, the depths of the despair that we can reach in so doing. And I don't like the notion that we would want to relearn that firsthand, but it feels right now as though many people are willing to wager that on some sort of theoretical prospect of material gain.
Well, I think they will. I mean, because one of the marvels of slavery is, if why were you a slave? I mean, if someone violated your human dignity, fight back, kill the master. But yet slavery has been a permanent institution in world history, and it's one that we should obviously eradicate. But there is some subservient quality in the human psyche that seems to take what master has to offer. And now the challenge in the new reparations movement, at least as far as I'm concerned, is you ain't never going to make me think I need a master, and you ain't never going to tell me I owe you something because of the color of my skin. It just won't happen.
Paternalistic government needs to be rejected. Government is not your dad.
Well, we've done it again, Mike. We've blown through 38 minutes of people's time. We've exceeded the half an hour allotment and not quite gone to 45 minutes, T-Girl. Sorry to disappoint.
Not bad. Well, our new goal on this podcast is to have our Twitter account reach at least 2,000 followers, and there's a very specific reason for that. If you visit Elon Musk's Twitter profile, scroll down, find the tweet, he actually says that those who can unlock subscriptions are going to have access to their own email databases. So where other places would not allow us to keep and contain our own email databases to take our following with us wherever we end up going in the future, Twitter is going to abide one of these, I guess until now, been sort of an underground principle of email is king. And so for that reason, we want to continue growing on Twitter and then connecting with you there. So if you're on Twitter, please consider giving a follow to @Pattis Podcast. We'll continue to kind of blow that whistle until we get some more reach and can blow it a little louder on our own.
because our commitment is to not be beholden to anyone financially, so that somebody like Fox News can't say, shut up or we don't get paid. And our commitment is to call it as we see it, so that when the mainstream media is giving you one spin and there's another that's equally credible or perhaps incredible, but worth examining, you can get it here. And you're going to want it here. The time is coming when it's going to be considered a crime to be heterodox. We intend to fight that with everything we have.
Heterodox. Love that. I think there's something called a Heterodox Academy. You need to look into that. Anyway, Norm, thank you as always. We will be back tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. You can find us here on Rumble, here on YouTube, here on Twitter Live. If you're not able to get to us live on any one day of the week, we're immediately available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, Overcast, etc. thereafter. Please share with one person, and please consider giving us a follow on Twitter @Pattis Podcast. And we'll talk to you tomorrow. See you, Norm.
See you. Take care, Mike.